Hello and welcome to a very special and long overdue episode of Ghettofabulous Kings of War. You may have thought, hey, I haven't seen Ghettofabulous for a while. Maybe he's gone dormant. He's given up on Kings of War. No, it's not. I couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, I'm actually deployed. I've been deployed for the last several months, so not a lot of games overseas on military duty. But I wanted to do something. I've been watching a lot of battle reports and videos and things, and I thought I should chip in and do something to help out a little bit to the Kings of War community. And one of the things I've seen with the battle reports I'm seeing is list building, either questions or issues. So I put together this little video. As you can see, it's called Army List Building 201. I was going to call it 101, but really, I'm not going to talk about, you get 4 troops for every horde, and you have to take a horde to get one of each type. Now, the super basics and adding up your points and crap, hopefully you're beyond that point. Instead, today we're going to look at a little more of the advanced questions. And what that really means is a series of questions or considerations to address to your draft army list. You're going to put together what you want, what you think is going to be good, and these are the questions you can ask to see, will this list be at least relatively effective? Not really focusing on this, a specific unit that you need to take of any type. In general, Kings of War is actually pretty good about not having units that are complete duds that you should never take, and there's no unit that you necessarily have to take. If you like a unit, you can probably take at least one and fit it into your army pretty effectively. Kings of War also, in general, is a little bit more rewarding of balanced kind of combined arms armies. Other games, Warhammer, is where my background's from, you were rewarded actually for being very one-dimensional, taking all armor or all very fast, mobile, shooty things, because then everything. I would take in 40k. I would take all my guys in chimeras and a couple tanks, and when you've got everything in armor, suddenly all the enemy's small arms and light machine gun type things are worthless. They don't do any damage, but all of your weapons are effective. At Kings of War, you can try to play with a very one-dimensional army, but it is more difficult. Or the way you could look at it is a combined arms army will have a much better chance against a very one-dimensional army than in some other game systems. And not going to discuss it too much in this, but one thing I keep noticing, especially with very new players, they like to add magical items to as many units as possible. In general, I would say don't go overboard with them. Just general guidance. A couple here and there, maybe for characters and maybe for very special units, but they should have a very specific purpose. Not every unit, and in fact the majority of your units probably do not need magical items. So, what are the army list considerations? There's kind of three different paths of questions we need to ask. And the first on the left here, we need to ask ourselves a couple things. Does the army list as drafted up by you, does it generate a simple coordinated game plan? Especially if you're in a tournament setting, your opponent may have a very complex, weird army you're not expecting. You could be rushed for time. A lot of tournaments have people drinking, so you may be under the influence of some alcoholic beverage. So it's good to have at least a general, easy to understand game plan. This army is attempting to fight in this way. It doesn't mean you have to. Obviously, you might need to adjust based on the scenario, based on your opponent, based on what units get destroyed. But in general, you have a rough game plan. The traditional one here, you have a meaty center. Troops, lots of infantry. If they're humans, if they're goblins, they may not be meant to destroy the enemy. They advance up the middle and hold the enemy. And then you have a mobile flanking element. Again, for humans, maybe this is a little stronger. Maybe this has knight regiments or beasts of war, something that's fast and hits hard. And their job is to destroy the enemy on one flank and then flank the enemy center that's held up by your not as effective infantry. And then you have supporting elements. Maybe it's artillery. You've got your inspiring guys moving around. It can be very one-dimensional. You can have an army of lots of shooty guys, and your goal is to try to shoot the enemy before they get to you. And you got a couple fast, or maybe not fast because you're waiting for the enemy to come to you. A couple of units that are very good at melee to counter the few units to get close. As long as you have a plan and it's easy to understand and follow, you're probably okay. Also, each army, each of the factions, have a built-in deficiency, a weakness of some sort. And when you're building your army, hopefully, you know what that weakness is when you're looking at the army list. For example, again, goblins, they don't have any flying units. Dwarves don't have very many fast units. Humans don't have very many elite, really hard-hitting units. You can take lots of units, but not very many good ones. So they can get jammed up easily. So as long as your army addresses those deficiencies, let's take orcs. They don't have very much shooting. You don't have to have shooting in an army to be effective, but understand what shooting and range attacks provide for you, and then you have that covered with other parts of your army. The example here, we'll look at just a simple, let's say, human army, okay? So in a human army here, we've got the meaty center, 3 hordes of infantry, a couple troops of infantry to screen if there's an enemy knight horde or something crazy that's going to charge and hit really hard. You want these little troops to take that main attack, and then your hordes can counterattack back. You've got over here on the left 2 regiments of knights. That's your hard-hitting flanker. On the right, we've got some smaller groups, probably light cavalry, and then we got some artillery pieces in the back. So, just like we talked about earlier, what's the rough game plan? You're going to have these infantry guys move forward and just try to tie up and hold the center. They're humans. They're probably not going to be good enough to kill much of the enemy's center, but they can try to hold it. Your knights are going to move up, hopefully overwhelm this one flank because you've gone heavy on this side, and then after they destroy the enemy, they're going to come across and try to flank the enemy central portion. These light cavalry guys on the right, they're light cav. They may screen, they may sacrifice themselves to buy some time against whatever the enemy has on this side, or because they're fast and mobile, maybe they'll work their way around, harass the enemy's backfield, or do some supporting flank charges. Because they're mobile, they've got a lot of options. And speaking of options, the artillery here in the back. They don't move much, but their long range lets them impact a lot of the board, so they add flexibility. If the enemy has a very overwhelming center, you can drop artillery on the middle here to try to soften them up. If the enemy has a lot of stuff on your left countering your heavy side here, you can drop artillery on them to try to soften them up to make your knights more successful. Those are options. That's the general game plan for this very generic type of army. Next, if your army has a general game plan, you understand it, it makes sense, it's something you can follow, and you're aware at least of what your army's deficiencies are, the next thing is, does it counter likely enemy lists? Now, there's two different things to look at. This first part is a list. The enemy's army really focuses on one type of activity, whether it's a flyer heavy list. It's got maybe an army that has lots of fast units, cavalry and chariots. Maybe it's got a lot of shooty, not just 1 or 2, but 4 or 5 ranged units, powerful ranged units. Maybe it's grindy. It's got a lot of earth elementals and healing caster guys, or a steamroller rush. It's just a bunch of basic infantry guys that are all maybe mediocre or good. Whatever it is, lots of troops, and they're just rushing forward, trying to overwhelm you. There's also, you can look at it from an elements perspective. Let's say you're your opponent has a balanced army, like hopefully yours is. If your opponent has a balanced army, what do you have to counter the one or two artillery pieces he may have? A large monster hero like a elf lord on a flying dragon. You need to have the appropriate tools in your army to deal with these things, or at least the right game plan. If you're thinking if your opponent has a cannon or a siege, a howitzer or something, some kind of artillery, your plan may be, I'm just going to tank it. I'm trying to move forward and attack anyway. I can survive a round or two of shooting from an artillery piece or two. Or I have healers. If the artillery gets lucky and if it hits a unit and does some wounds, I can probably heal them off. It's not a major issue. Or your counter may be, I've got a hero with the wings of the honey maze who can fly over and try to take that out. I've got long-range shooting of my own. It's more reliable. Instead of an artillery piece as one shot hitting on a 5 or a 6, I've got a troop of snipers that shoot 5 times hitting on 4s or 5s, and they've got piercing 2. Well, okay, that would be a good counter. That would be much more reliable and could take out an artillery piece pretty quickly. Large monster hero is going to fly around. Your counter could be, I've got a bunch of breath weapons, so if it flies behind me, we can just turn around and nuke it with a bunch of heavy firepower. We've got artillery, and I'm going to shoot artillery at it and force it to not set up a very beneficial flank or rear charge and force it to either rush in or hide. I've got a large monster hero of my own, and it's just going to shadow and keep it away. That's not really the most effective, but it's an option. I've got an individual hero with some kind of sword that can do a lot of damage, or at least enough to reliably do 1 wound and ground the thing. So my counter is I'm going to have it in the backfield. He's on a horse, so he's mobile. And if a large monster hero flies back there, I'm going to rush him, hit him, ground him, and some other unit will turn around and can flank it in the subsequent turn. I've got several units with surge, and I can surge units very far. So if a flying monster hero jumps in my backfield, wherever he goes, I'm going to have some pretty powerful units that I can surge into the flank or rear. Those are all options to deal with these individual elements of an enemy's army. Let's look at an example, though, for an enemy list. Using on the bottom here the same army we looked at before, the human army. We're going to have them up against an enemy human army, and in this case it's a bunch of cavalry and 3 pieces of artillery. No troops at all. So this army is very fast. They hit very hard on the initial charge, but they don't grind as well if you draw the fight out. If this human army had deployed like it did previously, just kind of balanced across the middle here, they would probably get overwhelmed on the flanks, and then the center would be flanked and destroyed. So instead, in this case, the army, again, just kind of throwing it together, they've opted to kind of deploy in a corner. That removes one flank. They can't get around the army on the bottom right flank. And now they're trying to force it into a protracted drag-out fight. These knights are going to have to charge in here, and then the humans with their infantry hordes can try to grind and fight back. Is it perfect? Does this army on the bottom have the advantage? A lot depends on what specifically are these units, what are the objectives for the game. But at least the army on the bottom has the right tools. Maybe these light cavalry guys can rush out and take this artillery out, and then this artillery can shoot over at the enemy knights, because these guys are infantry, they're height 1, and then they have the range advantage. Whatever it is, this army at least has the tools to have a fighting chance against this very extreme army. And that's when armies go for extremes. If you're building a balanced army, you're probably not going to have a hard counter. You're not going to have the advantage against this extreme army. But at least you have the tools you need to have a fighting chance. And that's really the best you can hope for with a balanced army. Do I have the tools of a fighting chance against all these different types of extreme armies? And the saving grace is the extreme army builds like this. There are certain other extreme builds that they will have a very difficult time with, whereas your army will have at least a fighting chance against everybody if it's constructed properly. So what's next? The last thing we have to look at is, does your army account for the scenario objectives? With the other things we've been talking about in constructing your army, all we've talked about is how do we fight and kill the enemy army. But realistically, that's not how you win in Kings of War. You win in Kings of War by completing the scenario objectives. And unless the scenario objective is kill, which in fact a lot of tournaments things don't even include, killing the enemy outright is not the path to victory. So what is the path to victory? Most of the scenarios currently emphasize mobility. You've got to get around the battlefield, and they're trying to emphasize unit strength. More hordes, more regiments, not as many troops. Also, when you're looking at the objectives, if you're going to a tournament or something, look very carefully at the tournament rules, the tournament pack. A lot of tournaments have their own special objectives, special quirks. And if you've been to the tournament before, you can look at pictures. Some tournaments will have more terrain, some tournaments will have less terrain. Those kind of changes will make certain things like Pathfinder or Strider more or less important. Shooting will be more effective if a tournament has less terrain. It'll be less effective if there's more terrain. But again, the tournament objectives are critical because, again, just killing lots of enemy units is not how you win. So you need to make sure that you have the right elements in your army to complete whatever objectives they are. If it's invade, mobility is going to be pretty important. If it's involving objectives or tokens, maybe having at least a couple tougher units so that they can hold and take a bunch of damage, because as soon as you grab the objective, the enemy is probably going to be trying to kill you. With all that being the case, let's take a look at this army list here. This is from a guy who puts quite a few battle reports out. Swordmaster of Hoeth, Outcasts. Now, when you look at this army list, especially if you're fairly new, this is not going to look like a typical army list. 2 regiments of Drakon Riders, a Drakon Rider Lord, and an Elven Prince with the Wings of Honeymaze. So you got 4 flying units right here. A regiment of Stormwind Cavalry and a troop of Stormwind Cavalry, so it's kind of the elf version of heavy cavalry. War Chariots, so I've got Shooting and Thunderous 2, I'm assuming. 5 troops of Silver Breeze Cavalry. So these guys have nimble, they have bows that hit on 4s, and they don't have Thunderous, but in melee they hit on 4s as well. So they're not complete slouches in melee. Mounted Elven Prince with Inspiring, so he can move around and inspire where needed. And then 20 Sea Guard. Again, they've got they can fight in melee pretty well, and they've got ranged attack. 2 troops of Palace Guard. So you guys are elite. They're hitting on 3s. They've got Crushing 1, 10 attacks. Not super devastating, but good enough that you can't just take them for granted, especially if they hit you in a flank or something. And an Army Standard Bearer, mounted again so he can keep up and move where needed, with the Loot of Insatiable Darkness. So let's ask ourselves a couple of the questions from before. Does this meet the basic requirements? Is there a simple game plan for this army? Kind of. It's not as simple as the previous army. But really, when we're looking at it here, we've got a bunch of very mobile units, including 4 flyers, and a small core here of troops that can shoot. And these guys are relatively cheap. You can throw them away as roadblocks. To me, what this looks like is you've got a very mobile army. You're going to try to use that mobility to overwhelm one flank of the enemy, maybe with a little bit of support in the middle from these ranged units, And then, if needed, you've got these cheaper units, either the light cavalry troops, these palace guard, that can stall parts of the enemy army while the majority of your army takes time, sets up rear and flank charges, and then does combination charges to alpha strike in a way, just knock out entire chunks of the enemy army piecemeal. Does it address the problem of the elf army list? The elf army is in general very elite, which means the units are expensive, which means a lot of our elf armies are kind of limited in the number of units they have, which means fewer scoring units. This army does not have that problem. If you look, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 scoring units in a 2,000 point army. That's pretty good. It's got enough scoring units, but now instead it's got a lot of fragility issues. None of these, I mean, there's no hordes here at all. Nothing here is very tough. So we've got plenty of units, but they're all very fragile. So instead, you've got a new problem. You have to either use mobility and flexibility to stay alive, or sacrifice things to keep critical units alive. Next, can this army counter common threats? Flyer mobilist? Well, this is a flyer mobilist, and it's probably got a lot more mobility than most. So I think it has the advantage in mobility. It's got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, at least 4. It's got 4 units with ranged attacks. That's pretty good. So against an army with a lot of mobility, one of the counters would be lots of ranged attacks. You put pressure on them so that they have to charge instead of setting up and taking time and being patient to work around the flanks and get rear and flank charges. If you're shooting them the whole time, they probably can't afford to do that. A tanky, grindy army. I think that would do very poorly in general against an army list like this. Most of those tanky, grindy armies are pretty slow. This army, I think, would do well, again, flanking around it, getting around the sides, and then setting up combination charges. And one of the ways to get around a tanky, grindy army is if you can do combination charges from the flanks, get lots of wounds at once. The enemy unit doesn't have a chance to heal because it's just overwhelmed. And one of the big strengths of this army list is it's very flexible. You've got lots of mobility, so the units can move around quickly. You also have lots of range attacks, which means even if the unit itself can't move very far, it can project and affect the battlefield, a large chunk of the battlefield. And several of these units, the Sea Guard, the Silver Breeze to a lesser extent, the War Chariots, are multi-purpose. They can shoot and they can do melee. So that lets you fill in as needed. If you need more shooting, they can shoot. If you need more melee, they can move in and do that. And one of the reasons mobility is so critical, again, let's just go back to this slide up here. This human infantry horde here, as soon as you deploy it, when you plop it down on the ground, its destiny is kind of set. It can only move so far through the course of the game. It can only affect so much of the battlefield. It takes time to turn. It can only move at a double if there's no stuff in the way. The enemy can very much interfere with it. Whereas when we're looking at this Drakenrider regiment or something, it flies. So right away it can turn and move 20 inches anywhere. It can very quickly get around the battlefield. So no matter where you put it for deployment, the opportunities where it can go and how it can affect the battle are endless. That's not saying that infantry hordes don't have a place in the game. It just means that they're not as flexible. And when you put them down, they have to have a much more specific role, whereas something like a Drakenrider regiment can adjust on the fly and can change its mission very quickly, or at least more quickly. Finally, can this army list complete scenario objectives? In general, yes. Mobility is kind of the key for most of the objectives. in the game, and this army has plenty of mobility. So basically, it has the most essential tool. It's got some problems. Again, there's no hordes. There's not a lot of unit strength within this army, and the units are fragile, so they can be destroyed very quickly. In a game, a mission where you're supposed to pick up tokens, for example, you probably wouldn't have many units here or be eager to pick tokens up right away, because whatever you pick it up with is going to get slowed down, and you're relying on your speed and mobility to stay alive. So instead, this army would have a different strategy. They would wait towards the end of the game, destroy most of the enemy army, and then focus on those last few remaining units with the tokens. Try to kill them and pick them up, and not hold them for very long. Just pick them up towards the end. That's a bit risky because maybe there's not going to be a good opportunity. Maybe your opponent, you roll double ones and don't break the enemy unit. You're introducing some risk, but it is a viable battle option. Dominate, trying to get the center of the board, within 12 inches. At first glance, also seems like it might be a bit tough. The general game plan usually for armies is deploy close to the middle, move up to the middle, and try to sit on it and hold it. But that general game plan is probably a bad idea against this army. This army wants to get around your flanks and your rear and do combination charges. If you mass up in the middle and just move into the middle and sit, you're just allowing this army to work itself around you and alpha strike in. So I think this army can accomplish those missions. It just has to play them a little differently than most armies do. I still think it's viable, though. So with that being the case, let's look at a different army. This is just some random battle report I saw. Got an orc list here. Just adding these up, I didn't get quite to 2,000, so maybe he left out some magic items or war gear or something. But in general, you can kind of see what this army is. You've got a bunch of infantry here, a horde of axe, a regiment of axe, and 2 regiments of great axe. Okay, some screening infantry. So it's kind of looking like that human army I built, just with orcs. A horde of gore chariots and a regiment of gore riders. Okay, that's the heavy mobile, harder hitting flank. You've got a war drum and a flagger. Okay, so with the banner of the griffins, that's going to give a lot of rally, probably to the center to keep them alive. A Crudger with wings of honey maze, and Crudger on a wing slasher. So a flying monstrous hero and just a flying hero. So yeah, it's very much, doesn't have artillery like my human army demo did, but it's got some flyers instead. Okay, let's ask the questions of this army. Does this army meet the basic requirements? Does this army have a simple game plan? Yes. In general, I'm imagining it's going to be like the human army. A meaty center, screening cheapy troops, hard-hitting mobile flanking troops, some support to keep the middle alive, and then you've got some flyers. You got an individual here who can hunt enemy individuals, who can hunt enemy artillery, and a flying monsters hero who's got a little more flexibility. He can work his way around the flanks. He can support this mobile element, I'm guessing mostly, trying to win a flank and then work his way into the flank of the enemy's center. Does it address the problems of the orc army list? Some of them. Some complaints of the orc army list are that it has relatively low nerve. I never thought their nerve was that terrible, but even if it is, you've got a bunch of rally here, so that's pretty good. The orc army list has very little shooting. This guy's decided to take none at all. That's fine. He's got some mobility here and some mobility here to allow him to project a bit and do damage at range with long-range charges, ultimately. So, okay, that's not bad. What else? Unlike the humans, which usually their infantry isn't that tough, or at least hard-hitting, these guys hit pretty hard. They've all got crushing 1 at least. These guys have crushing 2. They're not elite. They're only hitting on 4s, but they're going to hit harder than humans. So these guys could potentially win the fight in the middle against enemy infantry. And these guys, especially if the monstrous hero here is flying and helping with them, these guys hit pretty hard too. So you could say flexibility in that these guys are not just meant to stall, they could win and kill enemy units. Can this army counter common threats? Well, what are the common threats you're most likely to see? A flyer mobilist. I think this army, for example, the previous army I looked at, this army would have a lot of difficulty with an army with 3 or 4 powerful flying units. What are some of the ways you counter an army like that? We talked about long-range shooting. If you've got enough long-range shooting to threaten those units, they can't take the time to work around your flanks and into your rear and set up those multi-charges. They're going to be forced to charge in to shut down the shooting, and then you can countercharge. This army doesn't have any long-range shooting, so that's not an option. Do you have short-range shooting? Lots of breath weapons, throwing weapons, whatever it happens to be. Lots of short-range shots, so if the enemy does dive into your rear area and then try to turn around to get angles on your flanks and rear, you can punish them and keep them away. No, we don't have that. What do you have? The only thing that you really have if the enemy charges into your rear is this Crudger with the wings of honey maze. He can respond, change any direction, and charge 20 inches, and he's got enough. I think he's like crushing 2 with 6 attacks, hitting on 3s, I don't know. But whatever it is, he can reliably put a wound or 2 on just about anything. So it's enough to ground a large monster or a flying unit. That's it. The Crudger on the wing slasher isn't an individual. He can't turn on the spot and charge. He can stay behind your lines, try to keep enemy flyers away at distance. But if they have a lot more mobility, they could just avoid him and maybe work a different angle. So I think you'd have a hard time with that. Against a shooty heavy list, yeah, I think you have a better chance against that kind of list. You've got some tough troops here. You've got enough mobility. You might have to sacrifice some of them, charging into enemy shooting units to shut it down while the rest of the army catches up. But I think at least you have a fighting chance against a shooty heavy army. And again, with the mobility and objectives being the main focus, and you've got a lot of units here, you might be able to stall out the enemy and win on the objectives. Against a tanky, grindy type army, I think you got a good shot there too. You got a lot of crushing, so you can put a lot of wounds out, even on tough targets. Some of these things, like the Horde of Gore Chariots, they don't grind well, but they do put out a lot of wounds on the initial charge. So you've got the capability to, again, at least have a chance to fight well there. And Bane Chant on that flagger, when you start sticking that on a Horde of Axe or the Horde of Gore Chariots as they charge in, when somebody gets a lot of attacks, that puts a lot of increased value and really helps in burst damage to stop something from grinding away. Is this army flexible? Not as flexible, certainly, as the previous army. It's got low to moderate mobility. It's only melee, obviously, and there's no healing. So if a unit has a bad round of combat, or you happen to get hit with a lot of artillery one turn, a bad burst of damage there, you're screwed. You can't adjust to it. The flyers are really the only flexible units in this list. The only ones that can really fulfill multiple roles. The rest of the army's got one mode, really, of just trying to advance into melee as quickly as possible. It can be successful, but because it's one-dimensional and the tools you have are limited, there are certain either enemy lists or parts of enemy armies that you may have difficulty dealing with. Can this army list complete scenario objectives? Yeah, it's got a decent number of scoring units, 10. A couple of them, like these Orkling regiments, are weak, but in general, these units are a little more robust than the ones we saw on the Elf Army list. 3 of these scoring units have pretty good mobility, and with the entire army geared for melee, things like invade and dominate, where you got to move forward anyway, you're not leaving any points behind in your half of the table like artillery or something. So you got an advantage in some of those missions. And one thing I think a lot of people overlook, and it's good to have something like at least one Orkling regiment in your army, not only just for screening purposes, but sometimes you have an objective or a token or something in your rear half of the field, and you're stuck. It's like, well, if I give it to a unit and I move that unit forward, then that unit's at risk. But I want to keep it, if it's a token, if it's an objective, I want to keep something on it. But if I leave something in the rear, especially with this army with no shooting, you don't have something you can sit back and shoot into the fight. What do? Well, if you got an objective, you can just stick one of these Orkling regiments on it. You control it, you own it, and you're not going to miss, really, the Orkling regiment in the main fight. So you can afford to sacrifice one of these units to sit back in the rear area and try to ensure that you keep the objective. Now, obviously they're not very tough, so hopefully this objective is near cover or something so they don't get shot at as much. But it's a nice option. And again, when the game is so focused on objectives and scenario objectives, it's good to have that ability to win that and not just focus on killing the enemy so much. This last slide is this army. There's a graphic from the battle report. Well, there are several, but I pulled a graphic from the battle report with this army to show how they deployed and how they were kind of moving in the game. And my initial guess was pretty close. On this flank here, we see the Gore chariots, the Gore riders, and the flying monstrous hero all on one side. So he is trying to overwhelm one side with his hard-hitting mobile force. He's got the axe horde on the other flank. Seemed a little weird, but I'm assuming his general game plan is this flank is pretty well stacked. If the enemy does what most armies do, and they put hard-hitting mobile guys on one side, they may put hard-hitting mobile guys on the other side. And instead of having those hard-hitting mobile guys charge into like a regiment or something, or work their way around the flank, they'll kill regiment with their hard-hitting burst charge. But these guys have a lot of wounds. They're probably not going to be able to kill them outright. And then these guys would be better at grinding. This axe regiment would come up and flank and help out. So this guy is actually covering the other flank, and then these guys are the meaty center. I can see it working against many types of armies, but now when you're looking at this deployment and you're seeing this moving forward, the great axes, he's got the Orklings in the back, probably because this army must have had a lot of shooting. He didn't want them to get shot off the board right away. How would this army appear fare against that outcast elf list we saw earlier? They would be just deployed, probably relatively scattered out, not as wide as this probably. And then I assume he'd have maybe that Sea Guard unit and a couple of troops of Palace Guard in the middle, and all this mobile stuff would dash over to the right flank here. Second turn, some of it would jump in the back, some of it would be on the side, some of it would be in the front. And then turn 3, you'd have multi-charges into these 2 units, wiping them out. Maybe one of those Palace Guard troops comes over here to gum these guys up. Something else, other Palace Guard are shooting. All those riders and the Sea Guards are shooting at these regiments here. Probably this guy to keep him from coming over and helping right away. And you can see how that army would use its mobility to move around, wipe things out piecemeal, sacrifice a couple things to slow this side up, and then in the end you've got the majority of its army over here and only a couple remnants of this Orc army over here. So, hope that was somewhat helpful. Let me know in the comments below if I left anything out, if I need to include anything, if I'm full of crap and know what I'm talking about. Actually, I've been working on, I don't have a huge amount of time, but every once in a while I got a little bit of time. I've been able to work on, speaking of goblins, some goblins of my own. I've been kind of messing around with them before I deployed, and now I've got little bits of time here and there, and not many other distractions. So I've been able to paint up a few things. So maybe once I get them a little better looking, I'll post them up and get some comments. So anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.